times the largest civil society movement, CSO representation worldwide, and the only one that is by itself capable of stopping the advancement of the anti-democratic forces. So I would like to start to show you why the language that they are using is so powerful. Uh, 1 second, always happen the same. The first, here I'm going to show you some of the concept used institutionally by some of the main organization. This may look like the old 40 years old Washington consensus language. But if you see all these references, don't worry to read them, all of them. I'm going to go over them just to highlight some of the words, are from 2025. That means last year. The World Bank, the higher cost of of businesses, the lower levels of employment and productivity, the regulatory reset by the OECD, McKinsey, this multinational consultancy, streamlining regulatory requirements in relation to decentralization, the IMF, decentralized wage bargaining systems, the OECD, decentralized wage bargaining, the WEF, the World Economic Forum, or the so-called Davos gathering, deregulation. So we can see how the words are there. These are not just all debates. These are the advancement trying to shape the common sense to normalize the idea that regulation is a burden and decentralization means efficiency. And because the first battle is often over the words, the meaning, sorry, it's quite clear. I don't know. Oh, here we are. They change the word. Workers' protection, obstacles for economic growth, for productivity. Collective rules are then rigidities in labor markets. Union bargaining power are distortions. Job instability and insecurity are called for flexibilization or flexibility and modernization. We can see that once the people start to accept the words, half of the battle they won. We have to struggle very strongly in order to reverse this. This shouldn't be part of the common sense. That's why we think that we can name the deregulation and the decentralization in their own dimension. What's called deregulation is often the organized attempt to transfer the power from workers to capital, to erode the power of workers and transfer it to capital. Let's see why decentralization is the key tool or the key instrument in this discussion. Deregulation removes protections. Decentralization breaks the solidarity between workers. Decentralization fragments collective bargaining. The union's collective leverage is diluted because of that. The decentralization said that the common standards are replaced by localized concessions or individual negotiations, each time more particular, more idiosyncratic to certain firms, to certain sectors, even to certain individuals within the same firm. Capital play one group of workers against the others. And here is where we see those formal workers, formalized registered workers versus informal workers. We start to see a polarization, wider wage dispersion, higher inequality, weaker enforcement of labor laws, since the enforcement is very low, labor inspection doesn't have coverage. We should close that. That's not a road to go according to the common canonical wisdom. A greater scope for low rate road competition. We see how they start the race to the bottom for wages. Deregulation lowers the wall. Decentralization breaks the defense that we had for against the deregulation. Together, they weaken labor force as a collective force. And that's something that we cannot accept. And which is the shape that these struggles are taking? First, we should consider the cultural attack, the cultural battle, those that they had the chances of having political science training. You remember the concept by Antonio Gramsci about the cultural battle. And here we find how some things start to be in the common sense, or in the, I would say, in the way in which populations see business complaint, they turn into public truth. Regulations are expensive. Then we have this other uh, perception by employers. Employers' perception become the evidence to follow this. I would hire more people with less regulation. And we hear that we need less regulations in order to hire more people. Flexibility is seen as innovation. 21st century labor market is not the same as the industrial revolution. All these are the myths in which this discussion is being framed. Precarity is seen as an opportunity. Younger workers want freedom. They want flexible hours. They want to manage their time. They don't want to work from 9 to 5 as the old workers used to do. And then trade unions, and that's matter very much to us. It's seen as the major obstacle to growth. The old union model no longer meets the objective. The 21st century labor market doesn't need the old union leaders of the Industrial Revolution or the Fordist mode of production. The cultural battle for the of the regulation is one when some workers, are persuaded to see their own protection as the problem. And that's something that we have to fight against. But this also leads to what we may call the legal attack, the legal battle, the strip of rights, the weakening of enforcement, the atomization of the bargaining, the decisive concept between deregulation. It's also the decentralization, because the legislative reforms, they bring down employment protection also to be decentralized, dismissal rules to be different without several space or with different characteristics for each workers, labor inspection instead of being centrally managed in order to control and to have more budget. It's decentralized to local governments where they don't have the enforcement capacity, not even the labor inspection capacity. Wage setting institutions, instead of being more or less centralized, coordinated to avoid the race to the bottom, they are again decentralized. And sectoral bargaining, it's also seen as a constraint, so they want more decentralization, firm level bargaining to reduce the solidarity between workers. Decentralization is not neutral design. It's key part of the legal architecture of the fragmentation of the labor movement. But also we are talking about the economic factors, is how we shift the income, the risk, and the bargaining power from the workers to the employer. Regulation is just a cost. If there are regulations, we have to pay more. Environmental regulations, labor regulations, any type of regulation implies a higher cost. So the objective is to suppress wage growth and the targeting on living wages. They think that the living wage concept and the living wage implementation, it's also a constraint. Of course, they want to cheapen labor, but they also want to stop the organized and coordinated worker claims on sharing the fruits of productivity gains. They want to freeze the labor income share, or even regress the distribution of the social production. Employment protection destroys jobs, the other myth. Weaken collective bargaining institution. There is a skill shortage. All these are the ways in which the corporate sectors individualize employment risk in is this non-sacred alliance between some right-wing politicians, some politics, and the corporate sector. Economic deregulation is not about freeing markets. It's not that they want free market as the old Adam Smith speed. It's about freeing employers from social obligation and democratic constraint. That's the freedom that they want. And then we find the political dimension of this battle, dismantling democratic institutions, laws, and workers' protection in the name of productivity and competitiveness. So they reduce the scope of labor laws to concentrate in certain sectors or even erode them, decentralize the collective bargaining, eliminating the labor inspection, decorative social dialogue, only social dialogue to discuss some uh, 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 I would say abstract or long distance SDGs or other type of negotiation, and limits on the right to strike, which is another of the main exercise that we have as trade unions. The attack on regulations is also an attack on democracy because the regulations are the means by which real democracies interact with the economy and the society, not only by voting every 4 or 5 years, depending on the countries. We need protecting labor laws. Labor laws have to protect those that they have an asymmetric balance of power. There is an asymmetry between the power of an employer and the power of the workers, especially when we have high levels of unemployment or precariousness. We need rights-based social protection, and above everything, a new social contract, which has been our claim for uh, many, many years. So culturally, in order to wrap up, the myth looks nice, but they looks like natural, but culturally, they try to redefine rights as rigidities and insecurity as flexibility. Economically, they justify lowering wage floors, weakening job security, and shifting risks, all the risks, the capitalist risks, to the workers. Legally, they dismantle or decentralize these institutions that sustain collective standards. And politically, they marginalize union and narrow democracy by treating capital preferences as the general interest in the voice of politicians, in the voice of media communications, in the voice of the what we call the canonical wisdom. To finish, I would like to give you this quote by a journalist of the Guardian, George Monbiot or Monbiot, sorry. Deregulation is a transfer of the power from the trodden to the treading. It is unsurprising that all right-wing parties, independent, this is my adding, of the free market, nationalist or regulatory or whatever, of whatever, it's unsurprising that all right-wing parties claim to hate big governments because big governments imply regulation, implies more democracy, implies a social contract. I would like to finish here, colleagues, questions for later, and thank you very much for allowing me to participate in this event.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think they call that a tour de force. Uh, we're going to turn to our panels now, but if you do have questions for Daniel, please put them in the Q&A function in Zoom. I've also put into the chat a link to some of the myths and facts that Daniel discussed in English, Spanish, and French, so you can check those out in more detail. So now let's turn to the panel. We have 4 people with us today who are going to tell us about how this agenda is playing out in their countries or regions or sectors, and what unions are doing about it, what workers are doing to fight back. So first I'll introduce all of our panelists, and then I'll turn to Kathy Feingold as the first. So Kathy Feingold is the Director of International Development for the American Federation of Labor Congress of Industrial Organizations, commonly known as the AFL-CIO in the United States. She also serves as Deputy President of the ITUC and brings more than 20 years of experience in trade and global economic policy and worker, human, and women's rights. Ripan Chowdhury is the Secretary General of the Bangladesh Free Trade Union Congress, the BFTUC. He has over 25 years of experience promoting labor rights, occupational safety and health, climate action, just transition, and social justice at the international and national levels. Annick Ertz is Senior Policy Advisor on Company Policy for Industrial European Trade Union. That's one of the European trade union federations that represents the sector across the continent. And then Hod Anyigba is Executive Director of the Africa Labor Research and Education Institute and Chief Economist for ITUC Africa. So I'll pose the same question to each of you, and then I will give each of you 5 minutes to respond, but you should also feel free to respond to each other or to engage back and forth. So first, let's set the scene for the folks watching. How is the deregulation agenda undermining workers and democracy in your country or region or sector today? So let's start with Kathy in the US. Kathy, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thanks so much, and so wonderful to be here. And thank you to Daniel. Indeed, that was a tour de force. I think you helped give us a really important frame about what deregulation is about. And I like how you ended, a transfer of power. It's about this push and pull, and there is no greater example than what is happening in the United States around the fight over deregulation and who has power and how it is framed. I think you looking at the messaging, because it's very powerful right now, how the deregulation debate, and I would say a fight here in the United States, is being framed. So the Trump administration executive orders on deregulation have made one thing very clear in this country. They are going to undertake one of the most radical and extreme attacks on public protections that our country has ever seen. And I think many of you watched this maybe play out through the media, but let me go into detail a little bit. They have done this by trying to break collective power, and we saw this in Daniel's presentation, by weakening worker rights and eliminating collective bargaining for many public sector workers here in the United States. And remember, this comes on decades of what is called right to work policies in the US, which is a conservative agenda to undermine unions. So this is not something new. The administration is really just accelerating a foundation of deregulatory policies. You'll remember the infamous photos of the Trump administration the first few days in office, arguing that the path to faster growth and greater abundance is to cut back on regulation. Now, we're seeing this as both a domestic and a global issue that the Trump administration is pushing. As host of this year's Group of 20 meeting, the Trump administration is prioritizing deregulation. That is one of their top agendas, because they claim, as we saw in Daniel's presentation, that this is going to lead to innovation and growth. And we know everybody is going to benefit. We know that is not true. But we're seeing this is very dangerous, because as the Trump administration pushes this through the Group of 20 and other global multilateral agendas, we're seeing governments and multilateral institutions echo this, as we just saw on that slide. Again, this is not something new, but it is something that is being accelerated. The argument that the administration here is making is simple, right? They're trying to make a very simple argument to everyone. Rules slow things down, so fewer rules means there'll be more growth. Things will get better for everybody. It's a simple story that they try to paint here in the United States and in many other countries, but it's wrong. You saw it in the first few weeks of the Trump administration here through those photos of Elon Musk in the White House. Elon Musk, I need to remind everyone, was never elected to do anything in our administration. He was brought in with the Department of Government Efficiency to create, quote, efficiency in the US government, which is really code, as we saw, for deregulation, shifting power away from workers. And indeed, what we are seeing here is there is not greater efficiency, but rather a weakening in services and protection for workers in their communities. The Trump administration created a 10-for-1 mandate, requiring agencies to repeal at least 10 existing regulations for every new one that was issued. This was coordinated with DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, and this meant that critical programs were slashed, federal workers were fired, and 1 million federal workers lost collective bargaining rights. The Trump administration has already halted or moved to dismiss enforcement investigations in cases against more than 100 corporations. So we're done even regulating companies. The president has fired commissioners at multiple independent agencies, denying them quorum. It's a power grab, meaning that Congress, which is meant to hold the administration in check, is unable to hold them in check. The administration has gutted the U.S. Agency for International Development, the Department of Education and Energy, and the Environmental Protection Agency, all in the name of so-called governmental efficiency. So we are seeing, as the U.S. is hosting this, one more example, and then I hope we'll talk more about this in the next round. But artificial intelligence in particular has become a battleground in the United States around deregulation, because this again is part of the G20 agenda. But they are, revoking safety measures that were first put in place. They are trying to weaken the European guidelines that were put in place to safeguard the EU. There was a huge lobbying by the tech industry in the Trump administration. They are trying to create preemption of state laws. So they are trying to prevent our states from saying, hey, wait a second, we need to protect people around what is happening with artificial intelligence. And so the current battleground in the United States is weaken government, deregulate everything from environmental to worker protections, and then with artificial intelligence, make sure that there is no human safeguards, which we find incredibly dangerous in this current moment. The last point I would just flag is not only do we have artificial intelligence, but we have the industries that have yet to be regulated that can't get deregulated. So I'll just put that one on the table, which I would say is the cryptocurrency, and that whole world of digital assets, which could be very dangerous for worker pensions and for the global economy if they're not regulated. So here we have the crypto industry putting money into the pockets of both parties to prevent even regulation from happening, so it can't get deregulated, right? So that we're not going to have proactive regulation that focuses on the needs of workers and their priorities. I'll close out by saying that I think we need to retake the messaging that we saw Daniel put up on the screen. And we need to ask our policymakers, our leaders, these questions. Is that policy, is that regulation in service of strengthening and protecting workers and our environment and our communities? We need to recenter the conversation. We need to recenter the questions and really hold our leaders accountable, because the notion that this is just so simple, we'll just cut red tape and everything will be better, is a message that sounds very simple and that many people like to think is believable. But we need to push back and recenter it in what do working people need? What do we need to keep our families safe and healthy as there's new technology and as economies are shifting? And I think that's how we center, that's how we take on deregulation. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kathy. And yes, we'll certainly return to this in the next round. I want to take us across the world to a very different country that's not in the G20, but has experienced quite literally revolutionary change in the last couple of years, and that's in Bangladesh. So I want to give the floor for the next 5 minutes to Raypan Chowdhury from the BFTUC to tell us how this deregulation agenda is playing out in sort of the post-revolutionary order that's coming into place in Bangladesh. Raypan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Todd, and ITOC for organizing this important webinar. And also we see the Daniel's presentations that gave us a very clear picture, the reality and challenges of deregulations and its impacts on labor rights and the important things what need to do to defend the workers' rights under this situation, and also a good intervention by the Kathy from US perspective. So I'll start with a little bit on Asian experiences and situation, and also jump to the Bangladesh, the question you wanted to me. So deregulation across Asia, including Bangladesh, has been widely promoted as a strategy to attract foreign investment and accelerate economic growth. However, in practice, it has had significant and often harmful consequences for workers' rights, livelihood, and democratic participations. Firstly, the deregulations has contributed to the rapid expansion and of precarious and informal employment across the region. We have seen workers are increasingly engaged in short-term subcontracting or gig-based work arrangement. So these jobs often come with a little job security, no social protection, and limited access to collective bargaining. For examples, I can give you the example of India. Recently, labor reforms consolidated multiple labor laws into simplified codes aimed at improving the ease of doing business. While presented as modernization, these reforms have made hiring and retention easier and expanded fixed-term employment. Trade unions have raised serious concerns that such measures weaken job security and reduce workers' bargaining power. Similarly, if we go to see the Indonesian case, the omnibus law introduced challenges such as reduced severance benefits and expanded outsourcing. These reforms triggered widespread protest, and workers argued that their rights were being undermined in favor of investment priorities. Secondly, deregulation has contributed to the deterioration of occupational safety and health conditions in Asia generally. When regulatory oversight is weakened, employers often cut costs at the expense of safety and health. As a result, many countries in Asia continue to experience high rate of workplace injuries, occupational disease, and industrial accidents. For example, in Nepal, weaker enforcement of labor standards has led to rising workplace accidents, unsafe working conditions, including excessive heat, poor ventilation, and long working hours, resulting in recurring accidents such as mass fainting. Even more industrialized economy, the risk remain evident. If you see the 2026 factory fire in Korea, which claimed multiple lives, highlights how inadequate enforcement and production pressures can lead to tragic consequences. Thirdly, deregulation has undermined freedom of association and collective bargaining. In several countries, workers face legal and administrative barriers when attempting to form union or engage social dialogue. This weakens their ability to negotiate fair wages and decent working conditions. For instance, in Pakistan, union registration processes are often slow and restrictive, and workers attempting to organize face harassment and dismissal. In Thailand, we have seen recent legal framework have placed additional constraints on union activity, limiting workers' ability to collectively bargain. These examples demonstrates how deregulation and investment-driven policies can erode fundamental labor rights. Now, coming back to focusing to Bangladesh, these challenges are particularly visible in export-oriented sectors such as ready-made garment textile, where this sector has contributed to economic growth and employment. It continues to be characterized by low wages, long working hour gaps in labor standards and enforcement. Workers who attempt to organize unions often face administrative hurdles and employer resistance, including intimidation and dismissal. At the same time, a large proportion of the workforce in Bangladesh remains in the informal economy, including day laborers at the recycling sector, domestic workers, outsourced service workers. These workers are largely excluded from the formal protections and social security systems. And a recent protest by outsourced health workers over low wages and delayed benefit illustrate how precarious employment limits workers' ability to claim their rights. So deregulation also intersects with climate vulnerability, particularly the vulnerable country like Bangladesh. Workers in the sectors such as agriculture, fishery, informal, urban employments are increasingly affected by flood, heat stress, environmental degradation. Yet they often receive little support in terms of social protection or access to livelihood at alternative livelihood. This highlights the absence of just transition framework that protects workers in the face of climate change. So, in finally, deregulations has contributed to widening inequality, while corporate profits and investments flows have increased. The benefit have not been equally shared. Many workers continue to struggle to secure a living wage and decent working conditions. So, in conclusion, I'd like to stress that deregulation in Asia and Bangladesh is not a neutral economic policy. It has direct impact for workers' rights, safety, and democratic spaces. To address these challenges, there is a clear need for right-based regulatory framework, stronger labor inspection systems, and expanded social protection. And only they can economic and then can economic growth be truly inclusive, sustainable, and respectful of workers' dignity. Thank you. Over to you, Todd.
It's a big topic. Thank you, Repan. We heard about just transition in garment and climate sectors. We heard about the fights in Korea, the omnibus fights in Indonesia. You can see how this is affecting workers all around the world. And we've seen from both Repan and Kathy two very different national contexts and a lot of shared issues. So now I want to turn to a slightly different look, which is both regional and sectoral. And so I'm going to ask Annick Ertz to take the floor for 5 minutes. Annick is from Industrial Europe. The floor is yours.
Yes, indeed. I've been asked to give you the European Union perspective into this debate. I think the story I'm going to tell is not specifically related to industry. The story I'm going to tell affects all workers in Europe. Europe has always been known as a strong, for its strong labor rights, for social model. But unfortunately, with the 24 election, European election, this has shifted dramatically. In 24, we've seen that in European Parliament, extreme right and national conservatives have surged in size and in influence. We still have a majority of center-right socialists and liberals, but they're really under pressure by this right bloc. At the same time, there are also at regional, at national level, similar evolutions going on. For example, in Finland, there is already for many years a right-wing conservative government, which already simplified what they called dismissal procedures. They've already introduced more flexible labor contracts. They had cuts in sick leave, extreme cuts in unemployment benefits. In Lithuania, another country, yesterday there was a huge manifestation of 10,000 people protesting against the law that is really a threat for the public broadcaster and in essence a threat for media freedom. But these are not unique stories. From the north to the south, from the west to the east, right-wing parties are either in power or very dominant. And with this shift on national level also, and in the European Parliament, also the Commission followed that same shift, where in the previous Commission still focused on green legislation, on social legislation. The current Commission is really focusing on what you indeed call deregulation and using words as simplification, cutting the red tape, cutting costs, all the same words I've heard from the others already, to push for lower worker standards. This is not new. To be honest, already, if you look at the Global Rights Index of 25 already there, you saw the impact it had on workers' rights, on trade union rights. There are many restrictions in different member states on the right to strike. Workers, like platform workers, are excluded from collective bargaining. Union busting is in a rise, so we're not safeguarded from these unfortunate global trends. And this in a context, this in a market where there is wage stagnation, where there is high energy prices, high living costs in general. And if you look then at industry, also a big fear of disindustrialization. So this is really the context we're now working in. And with the new commission, this deregulation agenda is at a higher speed. They are really very fastly introducing new legislations that really threat workers' rights. I've heard the word omnibus already. Also in Europe, unfortunately, we know this terminology. In Europe, it means that the Commission introduced this term to amend existing legislation. in a very quick pace, in a very opaque way, and not with enough consultation of the stakeholders involved in this legislation. There are at the moment already 10 omnibus packages taking place. The first one was on sustainability reporting and human rights due diligence. There are omnibus debates going on the chemicals, on digital rights, on agriculture. It's really at a fast pace that Europe is now slimming down what they call administrative burden, saving costs. Nothing new. It's what the previous colleagues already mentioned before as well. It's happening in a very opaque way. They juggle with figures. They claim to save costs for companies, but when they come with the figures, we're not convinced that these are the real figures. So, is it real? Is it fake news? Are they selling their point based on their own figures, disregarding the real ones? For example, the whole Omnibus 1 debate on sustainability legislation, which is now already finalized, this debate. They claim that it saves costs for companies, but in an article that I've read today, this is already contradicted. Companies are now hiring lawyers, consultants to be sure that they are in line with these new Omnibus 1 legislation. They can't follow anymore. They don't. They need to make extra costs to be in line with this new legislative frame. For example, this Omnibus 1 debate on human rights due diligence, it has a serious impact on these existing legislation. The current directive covers much less companies. Accountability of companies is diluted. What previously was a strong human rights due diligence directive is really now weakened seriously. And that's not only on content, also what's really worrying is the process in which this was decided. It's really threatening democracy as such because they bypass public consultations. The role of the parliament is marginalized and business lobbies are favored instead of trade unions and civil society. So also there we see a strong threat of democracy. We're being bypassed. We're not taken as serious anymore as before. And that is really the trap we're now in. This what they call it competitiveness. I'm sorry, I'm always struggling with that word. But from a trade union side, we really do not believe in these recipes. We have another narrative. We believe in other recipes. There is an alternative. But for that part, I will answer that on the second round.
Thank you, Annick. Yeah, it's you don't have to worry about struggling with competitiveness because it's almost always a nonsense term anyway. We really appreciate your insights here. I'm going to turn to our last speaker for this piece of it, and then we're going to turn back to each of them to ask, what are we doing about it in our countries or in our regions? And I'm going to ask people to remember to keep it to a tight 5 so that we have time for questions at the end. So I'll turn to Hod from ITUC Africa, who will give us the regional perspective across the continent. Hod, welcome. You have 5.
Thank you, and greetings, comrades. As I was preparing to, give the African perspective, I was thinking about the definition of deregulation. Just going back to the roots, and it's interesting to note that the OECD, as Comrade Daniel in his presentation already alluded to, I mean, they say it's the elimination or simplification of government regulations that constrain, they use the word, they constrain the operation of market forces, right? So it's a certain technical term. But then in another document in 1997 by the same OECD, in a report on regulatory reform, in some little subnote somewhere in the document, they say, I mean, in terms of its broader view, the OECD's broader view on deregulation in modern terms at the time is usually a mix of deregulation, regulation, and institutional building, not simply removing the rules. So the same institution that is pushing for deregulation, ironically, somewhere in a subtext, somewhere small, give a footnote to say, oh, let's not just remove the rules completely. Let's keep regulation at some point. But of course, the capitalists will take what is useful for them and push that agenda. And that is what we continue to see, unfortunately. In the African context, deregulation has not delivered the promised outcomes, as we have heard from other areas. I mean, historically, as you would know, the promotion of deregulation in Africa has been closely linked with policy frameworks from the Bretton Woods institutions, particularly World Bank, IMF, in the most famous structural adjustment programs of the 1980s and 1990s. What that program was about was liberalizing, privatizing, public sector retrenchment, labor market flexibility as conditions for financial support. And that really weakened, our economies. And I can say it has weakened the economies till today, when certain state-owned enterprises were privatized, were mishandled, and corruption setting, and then we know how all that has turned out. But in contemporary period, you would think we would have learned something from the structural adjustment. But the whole thing has now evolved in a certain new generation proposal. So, for example, there is the Mission 300 energy initiative that is spearheaded by the World Bank to deliver electricity to 300 million Africans by 2030. You would think this is a fantastic idea, but hey, if you read the fine prints, it's the same deregulation track. Large-scale private sector participation, regulatory reforms. Let's take out the rules. Let's prioritize investors. Let's make sure the investment in energy is bankable. And as if that kind of program, the structural adjustment, didn't teach us anything, all the IMF-supported programs today continue to emphasize fiscal consolidation, wage bill containment, market-oriented reforms. And we saw this in Kenya, if you remember the Gen Z movement, when the IMF, advised the Kenyan government to put in certain taxes, excise taxes, and all sort of taxes, and the youth revolted. Unfortunately, we lost a lot of comrades, but the Nigerian colleagues were the trade unions were really behind them. So in a very recent study we did at Africa Labor Research and Education Institute of ITEC Africa, we tried to look at this sort of structural paradox between growth, sustained economic growth, sort of, and the paradox of the poverty that we continue to see because of this deregulation again, right? Where you have an extractive sector producing all the economic growth that a country is seeing, but growth elsewhere in agriculture, for example, in manufacturing, in construction, in services, is stagnant or even negative. So if you go to Nigeria, Angola, for instance, growth driven by capital-intensive extractive sectors has generated minimal employment. When we see that jobless growth elsewhere, like in South Africa, where youth unemployment remains over 50%, reflecting the limits of the so-called growth spearheaded by private sector under a certain deregulated and unequal economic structure. Because you see, in Africa, we have over 80% of workers in the informal sector. They are in vulnerable employment. So when you hear a statistic that unemployment in Africa is around 10%, ask yourself, how many of that are in vulnerable employment? Over 40%. That to the unemployment rate of 10%, you are getting very, very, and outrageous figures in the 50, 60% who literally do not have proper work to do. So this is causing, and in the next we'll talk about what unions are doing. But to give you a certain idea, for example, in Ghana, organized labor undertook a nationwide strike in 2024 against illegal mining. Again, another sector where private capital, has gone in there and are destroying the forest, destroying the water bodies, and people don't have clean water to drink, right? And this highlights how weak regulatory enforcement, particularly in this case in environmental and labor governance, undermines both livelihoods and public welfare. Similarly, across the continent of Africa, labor market reforms have weakened collective bargaining systems, and they have reduced the ability of unions to influence, for example, wage setting and working conditions. If you go to a place like Nigeria, where you have platform work in transportation and the delivery sectors growing rapidly, you find that also in Kenya, you find that in South Africa, you find that in Ghana. And the pity here is that government regulation is not catching up with what is happening, fast-paced in the private sector and what deregulation means in this sector. And so you have workers operating without contracts, without social protection, without enforceable labor rights, effectively reducing informality in digital form. I'll repeat that. This is effectively reducing informality in a new digital form. You can actually call that informality 2.0. So that is a big, big issue, a big sector where deregulation is affecting us. It is affecting our energy. It is affecting, platform economy. It is affecting domestic work. It's affecting so many sectors. So finally, in this context of deregulation, we cannot view it from a certain neutral policy instrument, right? It is a structural force, we think, that is reshaping labor markets, which is redistributing risks to the workers, to the unemployed, and capital is allowed to win. It is a one-sided agreement. The social contract here has been completely broken. It is undermining the socio-economic foundation of democratic governance. And I'm sure that is why we are here when discussing this issue. So the central claim for me that deregulation drives employment, that is a non-starter. It is, we should completely say it is nonsense. It doesn't make sense. Growth is therefore not supported, as we have seen. Growth, and we continue to hear that we should we should have this deregulation to support employment. We are not seeing it on our continent. Maybe, Todd, you are seeing it in Europe. You tell us.
No, absolutely not. Quite the opposite. And it's not just Africa or Europe or the US. We see in the chat here, Neha says a new labor code was implemented in India earlier this month, and they're seeing a striking set of similarities to what you're all discussing as we go. And that's why we have these discussions, because too often we think this fight is local or limited to certain personalities or in our governments. But in fact, as both Daniel and Hod have laid out, it's a structural force at play here, and there's particular political forces that back it. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground already, but I want to, and we're a little bit behind time, but I do want to get to we've defined the problem very, very well. So what are we going to do about it? And so for that, I want to go back through our panelists one more time. I'd ask you to try to keep it brief, understanding it's difficult given the subject matter. And then I will go to a very short Q&A. We have a couple of questions in the bank already, and then we'll go to Evelyn to close us out with the global view. So Kathy, let's go back to you. We know, everyone around the world knows, as you said, it feels the effects of the Trump administration, not in the same way that an American worker does. But what are the unions doing to fight back against this deregulation agenda, especially in the context of this G20 coming to town?
Thanks so much for the question. I think what we've heard through all of these wonderful presentations is this, again, the issue of power. And so I think if the main objective of deregulation, as was laid out in the first presentation, is to shift power upward to the wealthy and to corporations, then we need policies that are going to counter that objective. So that would be the first thing. So here in the US, let me just start by saying it's clear to us that in order to change what is happening, we need to organize. And I know that sounds, we say that a lot in these contexts, but really to be quite clear, we must grow our membership if unions are going to be critical to the change in democracy in our workplaces, in our country. If we don't have the power to contest what is happening, then deregulation will continue to weaken us, right? And we're already seeing this interplay of, if you remove collective bargaining rights from 1 million federal workers and they're not paying, many of them don't continue to pay dues, that weakens our ability to fight these policies. And so it's all interconnected, the ability to organize. So the first thing is, and we are investing in that in the United States, and as we head into the AFL-CIO convention, organizing again is going to be a key priority. We're investing heavily in the south of our country, where historically unions have been weaker for many of the policies that we've heard about. We see organizing workers into unions as, again, fundamental to challenging the impacts of deregulation. So collective power is also needed for voting. And you are going to need to change the leaders and the lack of sort of accountability that we have in our Congress. So for our midterm elections, again, you need to organize members so that you can communicate with them and get them to vote and to be educated about what is happening and the negative impact of these policy agendas. This is, we're operating in real time. We have these midterm elections and we feel the weight. As I listen to the presentations from HUD and Bangladesh and everybody, I mean, the impact of the policies that the United States is pushing is impacting all of the regions that we just heard and all of the sectors from industrial and others in Bangladesh. So we take this very seriously. Free and independent elections are critical for a healthy democracy. And if you've deregulated everything, then it's very hard to ensure that you're going to have those free and fair elections. You're going to invest in those institutions that can ensure that. And then we're engaging in policy discussions that are going to shape those policies. So one of the things that President Schuler, the president of the AFL-CIO, has created is a technology institute. We have a whole separate tech institute to deal with this contested space that I talked about at the beginning. Since tech is so critical, again, it's not just magical that AI is going to take jobs. It's how are we going to shape AI and the policies? These are contested questions that we need to be a part of. And so very concretely, we are spending a lot of time thinking about that. We have, we can put in the chat our workers first principles around artificial intelligence, which we think have been very helpful in countering the narrative here in the US that, you know, why would states need to regulate anything around artificial intelligence? Why are they harmful to young people and social media? Why do we need the Europeans to have artificial intelligence protections on their side of the Atlantic? So we need to anchor ourselves in this is who we are. These are our values when it comes to technology. We're not anti-tech. We are pro-worker shaping technology that will lead to what everyone was saying, will actually lead to job growth, not just this, you know, deregulate and everything will just pop up for workers. No, we know it needs to be an intentional set of policies. We don't think anything will be magically done if workers are not at the table creating safeguards for fair, safe, responsible, and worker-centered AI. And again, I mentioned in the first round, and I will end here, is I think we need to have our eye on the shift to new kinds of currencies that have no regulation. Working people have fought to make sure that our systems are regulated when it comes to pensions, when it comes to how banks operate. But when you have a whole set of assets that are no longer going to be regulated or have never been regulated yet, and are being controlled right now by many folks in the Trump administration. You can see them profiting. And most people don't have even the education and understanding of how these new digital assets work and could impact our lives. We, again, need to be out there. And so we are actively lobbying around this issue in the United States to hold our leaders accountable to make sure those assets don't negatively impact workers. So organize, get into concrete policy, not just saying workers need a seat at the table, but what are we doing with that seat? And then exercising our power in the workplace, at the ballot box, and at every level in our country. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Kathy. Very clear. let's go to Repan in Bangladesh to tell us what workers are doing there. And then for time, I'll also say Anek will follow and then Hode. And then we'll go to Q&A. But you heard here from Kathy some very concrete steps that they're taking, both strategically and on specific pieces of work, like the Workers First initiative, which I've put in the chat. Repan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Todd. In the second round, actually, what we are doing in Bangladesh to fight back, the question is, the response is very clear and to share is that Bangladesh Free Trade Union Congress and the unions in Bangladesh plays a critical role at the national level in defending workers' rights and strengthening democratic governance in the face of deregulations and weak enforcement and growing precarious employment together with our affiliates at cross-sector and key allies such as SCOP and I2C Bangladesh Council. So this is about defending the labor rights of our members and workers, organizing and building workers' power, promoting a democratic industrial relations system in the country, fostering freedom of association and collective bargaining at national sectoral enterprise level. And BFTC plays actively support workers, particularly in export-oriented sector like garment, textile, and as well as in the informal economy to form and register trade unions and to bargain collectively at workplace on workplace issues in accordance with the labor law, which just this today the new the parliament has passed the new labor code in Bangladesh. Is one of a big fight for the labor unions for many years to have a democratic labor law, and we'll see that how the new labor code that has passed today has implications on protecting workers' rights in coming years. So in many cases, workers attempting to organize face victimizations for the case of Bangladesh, unfair labor practice, harassment, intimidation, or dismissal. So our organization, BFTs, and all the unions in Bangladesh provides trying to provide legal aid and advocacy to protect these workers and ensure their rights are upheld under the national labor law. And doing so, it helps workers gain collective power in negotiating wages, working conditions, and workplace safety. Unions in Bangladesh place a strong emphasis on occupational health and safety. That is one of the big priority area for us. And workplace accidents and unsafe conditions remain a serious concern in Bangladesh. Recent data indicates worrying rise of work fatalities and reflecting systematic gaps in enforcement. And also we are so these efforts are particularly important in the light of prevent repeated industrial accidents, including factory fires, structural failures, which highlight the human cost of weak regulation. We are strongly advocating for social protection and decent work, especially for informal and contractual workers who are most vulnerable. As I said in my earlier presentation, a large portion of the Bangladesh workforce remain outside formal protection system and leaving them without access to minimum wages, social security, and compensation mechanisms. So our campaign is for inclusive policies that ensure fair wages, social protection coverage, and support for workers affected by climate change disasters such as coastal fisheries workers, day labor, and the risk communities. So Union in Bangladesh is actively engaged in policy advocacy area and national and advancing social dialogue. It works with government agencies, employers, organizations, and international bodies such as ILO to push for stronger labor law enforcement, right-based regulations. This includes advocating for improving union improving union registration process, strengthening enforcement mechanism, and ensure the implementation of the Bangladesh government's commitment, the international such as ILO roadmap and EU action plan to protect labor rights in all of the countries. Through these platforms, trade union highlights the risk of deregulations, and including the risk of precarious work and erosion of labor practice. So importantly, we from the BFTC work, our work is also reflects broader connection between the labor rights and democracy. During the recent pro-democracy movements in Bangladesh, workers and trade unions played an active role in demanding not only for fair wages and safe working conditions, but also accountability, civil liberties, and democratic spaces. This underscores that freedom of association and collective bargaining are not just labor issues, they are fundamental democratic rights. At the same time, labor unrest linked to wages and working conditions has exposed the vulnerability of workers in Bangladesh. We have seen in recent years protests in industrial areas have led to injuries and loss of life, reflecting the tension created by low wages, unsafe working conditions, and limited avenues for dialogue. So these incidents further highlight the urgent need for stronger protection, bolstering democratic practice and culture of labor market, industrial relations system in the country, and meaningful social dialogue. So I will, in the conclusion, our approach combines with organizing, union strengthening, building healthy tripartite social dialogue and policy engagement at all levels, though these efforts is seek to empower workers, protect vulnerable communities, and promote a fairer, safe, and more inclusive labor movement in Bangladesh. Ultimately, strengthening workers' rights is essential not only for economic justice, but also for advancing democracy and social equality. Thank you. Over to you, Todd.
Thank you very much. We're hearing similar, straight, we hear organizing, we hear collective bargaining, social dialogue in some contexts too. And I imagine we'll hear similar strategies but from Anik, but I'm curious, Anik, how is Industrial fighting back and how are workers at the European level fighting back?
Yeah. Let me begin again with the first attacks. The first attack of the Commission was on the existing legislation on human rights due diligence. At the time of the attacks, even well before, we already had a project with our sister federation on global level. We were already organizing practical tools for our affiliates on how to use HRDD as a trade union tool. And you can imagine that these attacks really, in the first instance, was a shock for us. It really, we were already trying to transpose what was current legislation and was now then revised with this omnibus. So first reaction, a shock, but luckily we woke up quickly and we decided to fight back and defend what was a good piece of legislation. The HRDD legislation was a firm scope and accountability in it. And we fought back together with the Confederation, ETUC, and also the other sector federations. We tried to lobby for maintaining as much as possible the current directives. Of course, we need to do much more than that. And as Industrial, we decided to look at our own campaign. We had a running campaign, Good Industrial Jobs. And I think we really wanted to build up our own narrative, our own belief in the future of European industry, our own belief in good industrial jobs. And that's why we relaunched this Good Industrial Jobs campaign with common demands and common actions. For example, on the 5th of February this year, we had a short manifestation, not only in Brussels, but all over Europe. And with this campaign, we want to take control of the debate and want to promote our own recipes, because the recipes they are now presenting for industry is a political choice. It's not the only solution. Political level can make other choices. They choose not to invest heavily. They choose to deregulate. But what we present with our Good Industrial Jobs campaign is 5 specific demands focusing on investment over austerity, for example. We really push for a massive European investment plan, focusing on modern infrastructure and high quality jobs, not social dumping. We advocate for just transition, just transition on company level and sectoral level that is negotiated with unions, not imposed by employers' organizations or management, central management in multinational companies. This is the only way forward to ensure that green and digital transitions are not threatening the jobs of industrial workers. And we have a long list of other demands as well, which we now push forward with our industrial jobs campaign, both on political level, but also in towards employers and employers' organization. At the same time, we also think it's important to have to fight the far right. We had a lot of internal debates with our national unions on how we can exchange on how we deal with these far right parties, because our workers are voting for them. How can we make some recommendations in order to empower our national affiliates to shift this trend? One of the recommendations we have towards our organizations is to integrate democracy training in their standard trade union education, just to make sure that representatives are familiar with the rhetorical tools that far rights are using on the shop floor to convince workers. Other suggestions we made is what we committed ourselves to is to collect data that proves that far right parties are not voting in favor of workers' rights. On the contrary, they are voting against it. We also recommend that unions maintain a strict policy of non-cooperation with anti-democratic forces. We encourage our affiliates to build local alliances with civil society to protect the rule of law. So this is a bit a flavor of this action plan that we presented in our executive committee for our fight against the far right. But at the end of the day, of course, also like Kathy said, she began with it, organizing. This is really at the heart of our trade union work. This is not new. We have to continue doing that, but maybe look for new ways of organizing this. For example, we have a project in the battery sector. This is an upcoming sector in Europe, mainly active in Central and Eastern Europe. And there we try, with this project, we try to support our affiliates to organize workers there and to be sure that we're present also in these new emerging sectors. So if you look at our solutions, what we try and do is to make a combination of a strong industrial vision with our own trade union, recommendations for a strong industry based on good industrial jobs. But these need to go well hand in hand with a well-organized European workforce, and therefore we need to keep on investing in organizing workers across Europe.
As an organizer, I'm really loving this. You can see if you could just keep saying organizing all the time, I feel much better. I will put in the chat a little bit about what the ITUC has done to try to support organizing by our sectoral colleagues at the Global Union Federations and also the affiliates of our affiliates in the national centers. I'm going to turn now to Hode. Tell us, what's the fight look like in Africa? And are we going to win?
All right. Winning is it's a tough word here, but I'll tell you what we have been doing. I know we're running out of time, so I'll try to be short. First, unions in Africa are engaging directly in economic processes at national and continental levels. It's another way to look at it. So, for example, in Africa, there is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. It's a way companies can get in to create jobs and to stimulate the economic transformation that Africa needs. However, we realize that there are no dedicated labor protocols to safeguard workers' rights within trade integration processes. And if we don't take care, this will become a big problem in the future with the way deregulation is being promoted in the so-called free trade area. So, for example, last year, unions on the continent, together with the civil society partners, the Stop the Bleeding campaign, we marched Todd, you talk about organizing. We mobilized thousands and thousands of workers to march the streets of Accra and went to the AFTA Secretariat to present a petition on how we want AFTA to work for us and where deregulation must stop. And so that petition was presented to the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area, Wam Kelly. And I must say they were quite scared when they saw the numbers, the multitudes that came to the Secretariat to present that petition. So we are also doing our part. We are mobilizing and pushing. In countries like I mentioned, in Ghana, the unions there have been fighting illegal mining and other energy pacts like the ECG pact, the PDS that we witnessed in Ghana. The unions have been very upfront with that. Similarly, in South Africa, trade unions have consistently engaged in national debates on wage policy, public sector reform, social protection. Unions have been doing that. Trade unions are also innovating, organizing strategies, particularly in response to changes in the world of work. For us, we had on the continent a meeting where we say we are going to help mobilize the multitudes we have in the informal sector. Remember, I mentioned some 80% in the informal economy. So governments are taking advantage of that and pushing this deregulation in all sectors, because then you have a huge sector of the population who are not organized and therefore are not able to come together to fight, this private capital. Evidence from Kenya shows this. Evidence from even Uganda shows this. Youth organizing is beginning to be a big thing. Digital mobilization is another, and new forms of worker representation that would recognize the need to adapt to platform-based labor or other, informal sector especially. And of course, this includes issues like establishing these youth structures within the unions. We need to expanding membership in the informal sector. We need to develop all these new models that are suited for even precarious work. And we are working in it. Another interesting area is peace building and democratic governance. And ITC Africa has been pushing this together with the affiliates on the continent. So in the just recent flagship program by the ITC Africa, we call the New Year School, there was a resolution explicitly stated that recognizes trade unions as key actors in 1, social dialogue, 2, conflict prevention, and we see that across the continent and now even global, and 3, the defense of democratic institutions, which we see as very, very critical. So in countries that are experiencing this fragility or political transition, unions are participating in national dialogues. And in West Africa, there have been some military juntas that have come to be the kings. And interestingly, the youth and citizens are warming up to them, unfortunately, because they feel the democratic dividends that the so-called liberal democracy did for them was not the best. And unfortunately, people are happy about these juntas because of the repercussions, or because of the issues that democracies before them achieved. And we need to change this. We need proper democracy, and we know it's only through democracy we can achieve these structural changes that we need. So across the continent, unions are working with civil society, faith-based institutions, regional bodies like the African Union, and you know that ITC Africa has now, or is in the process of opening a liaison office in Ethiopia to work closely with the African Union, so the African Union can push our messages to the powers that be that are pushing these unhealthy deregulation agenda on the continent. So in conclusion, On the continent, we are advancing very clear alternatives to deregulation. We are advocating for labor-centered economic policies. We are defending democratic institutions, and we have a number of workshops that we continue to hold with our affiliates, and the unions are all in. We are trying to address these structural drivers of inequality and instability. And so for us, this is not simply resistance. It is reconstruction, a reconstruction of an economic model in which growth is aligned with employment, in which growth is aligned with dignity, in which growth is aligned with social justice. So because, ultimately, the African experience has shown that economic policy cannot be divorced from democratic outcomes, and trade unions remain very central to bridging this divide. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, brother. I think you've rounded up the panel really nicely there. And we've heard a few things come up again and again. We heard education. We saw this in the chat and in some of the questions. But we also heard from Kathy and Anik about this too, the need for education on deregulation, on the forces that are actually at play, on how the economy is changing. Organizing, we heard many times. But I also think the framing of the webinar has turned out, you've all painted a picture that shows it's quite good. It is deregulation versus democracy. When we see deregulation, we should immediately begin thinking that what is this going to do to undermine democracy? And Hod, what you said at the end there is something that we hear a lot at the ITUC. The loss of confidence in democracy is often because not because people had bad democracy, it's because they never really had democracy at all. So when you talk about the need for proper democracy, this is what we're often talking about. And when we talk about democracy at work, we're talking about the fact that for most people, they go to work every day and they spend most of their waking hours in a place that's not democratic, which is the workplace. So really powerful stuff. Thank you very much. We are very behind on time, so I'm going to catch us up, and before I hand it over to my colleague Evelyn. In the Q&A, thank you for those who have submitted in the Q&A. We have a lot of good questions in here. Some of them I think have been answered as we go. And the talk about training and regulation, I think we've addressed a bit. There is a question on, a couple of you have mentioned the side on climate and the environment. And how do we interact with organizations opposing environmental deregulation? I think many of you have answered this already. I specifically heard from Anik and Hod about the need to engage civil society. At the ITUC, we find common cause with a lot of different civil society organizations, and some in ways you might not expect. So, for example, we collaborate with Greenpeace. We often are not actually discussing climate issues at all, but we're discussing right now is the fundamental attacks on basic rights, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, lawsuits being used to try to restrict those types of freedoms. So we find often that there's a common set of foundational democracy issues that all of these organizations have in common, even if we might diverge later on certain policy items. So there is a lot of existing collaboration across your organizations and the ITUC on this. I would like to hand it over to Evelyn. If other questions do arise, please put them in. We'll answer them in text, in writing back to you. But I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Evelyn to bring this all together and bring the webinar to a close. Evelyn.
Sure. Thank you so much, Todd. And let me first of all say that this has been a great discussion. I've really appreciated it. And I want to really emphasize that while the time is limited today, it won't be our last discussion on this. But it's evidently clear from all of the interventions that across the world, we are experiencing right now a global push for deregulation, undermining labor protections, suppressing wages, weakening collective bargaining, and trade union power. And we should not forget that this deregulation agenda is very much going hand in hand with austerity, trade liberalization, privatization, as business interests are being prioritized over those of workers and ordinary people. These are prescriptions that are embedded in the policies of many international institutions, as Daniel highlighted in the beginning of this. Just look at the World Bank, which right now is ranking countries positively based on how easy it is for them to do business with their Be Ready index. But look also at the OECD, look at the G20 this year under the US presidency, and look at it on the regional agendas of, for instance, the EU, as rightly pointed out by Annick from Industrial. These are policy agendas that are shaping labor reforms at national level. They are undermining unions across sectors, but it's also clear that this is a narrative that's not evidence-based. It is a recipe that has been already tried and it has failed. And the central claim that lowering the cost of doing business to drive growth and jobs, it's shown not to be true. It's economically counterproductive. It has eroded rights and working conditions, and it's deepened inequality. So we as unions, we are calling for a different path. We are calling for one that rejects a race to the bottom on wages and rights, and instead pursues an approach to job creation that is actually grounded in strong rights-based regulation that delivers decent work and a fair share of economic progress. And as you heard today, unions are mobilizing. We've heard how unions are mobilizing at the national level, at the regional level, and of course at the international level. Next week, at the spring meetings of the international financial institutions in Washington, the ITUC and the global unions, as well as other union representatives, will be pushing back against the false narrative promoted by the IFIs to lower labor protections to support jobs and growth. The ITUC and the global unions will be advancing an alternative narrative, one based on strong rights-based regulations and decent job creation. Within the G20, as you heard from Kathy, unions are working together under the leadership of the AFL-CIO's L20 presidency to push back against the false deregulation narrative and promote an alternative vision for the G20. We are going to help strengthen the evidence base and the research base, showcasing how deregulation recipes have failed. Because as you mentioned, Todd, so rightly, we need to make sure that there's education out there to counteract this narrative. As a very first step yesterday, we published a short briefing that unions can use debunking the myths of labor regulation, compiling the evidence against it. We've shared this in the chat. I invite you to take a look. It's available in English, French, and Spanish. And we do plan to hold further exchanges between trade unions as well as experts on the topic in the coming months to exchange on evidence and experiences, to coordinate our strategies to counteract this agenda. So if you want more information or you wish to take part, please reach out to us. More broadly, we will continue to support unions in efforts to regulate decent work, underpinned by fair and living wages, rights to organize, strong collective bargaining, adequate universal social protection, robust protections to workers' safety and health, building on the achievements that we have already won at international level, including, of course, international labor standards. This year, we will work to further strengthen the international regulatory framework, in particular through winning a binding convention on decent work in the platform economy. And we're also continuing to work to shape a binding UN treaty on business and human rights. We will call for rights-based regulations in the deployment of new technologies. This has come up in the discussion at several points, as well as in the chat, around how artificial intelligence is being deployed without consideration for the risks that this actually poses to workers in terms of jobs, rights, and working conditions. We need to make sure that regulation keeps up with these new realities. So we're planning a workshop next month with trade unions to take stock of efforts to regulate the deployment of AI and new technologies in the workplace and jointly identify key provisions on regulating AI. And finally, as negotiations continue around the development of a UN tax convention this year and next, unions are calling for strengthened international tax rules to stop a race to the bottom between countries and enable corporations and the wealthy to pay their fair share so that workers do not have to carry the burden. There is a lot of work to be done, but I really want to emphasize that we, as a union movement, we are the largest economic force in the world. We are the largest democratic force in the world. And when we act together, we have the power to advance, as Brother Hod would say, an alternative economic model, a model that is grounded in decent work, in fairness, and in economic justice. So thank you, brothers and sisters. The work continues together. Let me just close with a word of thanks. Thanks to all of the panelists for these very rich contributions. For everyone who has attended, thank you for your active participation. Thank you, Todd, for the organization, as well as the excellent moderation. To Philippe and our comms team for all of the support and the preparation. And of course, to our interpreters who've enabled us to understand each other. So thank you very much.